Imagine a tidal wave, not of water, but of thick, dark, sticky molasses, 40 feet high, racing down a city street at 35 miles per hour, an apocalypse of sugar that would drown men, crush buildings, and leave a stench that lingered for decades. This isn't a scene from a forgotten B-movie. It's the absolutely true and bizarre catastrophe that engulfed Boston's North End on a deceptively mild January afternoon in 1919, a day when the promise of sweetness turned into an unbelievable, deadly deluge. The air was unseasonably warm for January 15th, a balmy 40 degrees Fahrenheit that felt like spring compared to the usual biting New England winter. World War I had ended just 2 months prior, and America was buzzing with an electric, almost frantic energy, a blend of relief, economic expansion, and the uneasy dawn of Prohibition. In Boston, particularly along the busy waterfront of Commercial Street, life revolved around the steady, rhythmic clang and hiss of industry. It was a place where immigrants from Ireland and Italy carved out a new existence, their days marked by hard work and the constant, overwhelming aroma of the nearby Purity Distilling Company. Purity was a massive operation, a key cog in the machine that refined imported molasses, a byproduct of sugarcane processing, into industrial alcohol, which was then used in everything from munitions to rum. The cornerstone of the Purity operation was a colossal riveted steel tank, the single largest storage vessel of its kind in the entire city. Erected in 1915, it stood 50 feet tall and 90 feet in diameter, a hulking, imposing fixture that dominated the skyline near the elevated railway. It was a monstrous metallic drum, holding court in a densely populated neighborhood, and on that fateful day, it contained approximately 2.3 million gallons of raw, unrefined, fermenting molasses. This was not the quaint syrup one poured over pancakes. This was a thick, viscous goo, heavy with potential alcohol, a dark, nearly black substance that weighed about 12,000 tons. The sheer volume alone should have been a warning. In the preceding months, there had been myriad complaints, dismissed with the bureaucratic nonchalance of the era. The tank had leaked almost immediately upon completion. Local children, always curious, would bring containers and scoop up the sweet, syrupy leakage from the base, a sticky stream the company had attempted to camouflage with a coat of brown paint. Neighbors reported deep, metallic groaning sounds emanating from the structure, a basso profundo complaint that seemed to vibrate through the very pavement. One Purity executive, Arthur Gell, a man whose subsequent testimony would expose a shocking corporate negligence, had simply ordered the tank be painted the same dark color as its contents to hide the telltale streaks of leakage. He bypassed proper testing, ignored the structural engineer's warnings about the tank's too thin steel plates and its potentially fatal lack of a hydrostatic test, filling it with water to check for leaks. Gell, rushing to capitalize on the wartime demand for industrial alcohol, had effectively signed the death warrant of nearly 24 people. It was 12:30 p.m. Lunch whistles had blown, and the street was unusually busy. Teamsters were watering their horses, dock workers were heading back to their shifts, and a group of municipal workers were enjoying a break at a station house directly across the street. Children were playing near the elevated railway structure, their laughter echoing off the cold brick buildings. The molasses, stored cold and heavy, had been undergoing a slight yet critical temperature change due to the mild weather, initiating a process of fermentation within the tank. This process generates carbon dioxide gas, which had been slowly building pressure against the already compromised steel shell, pushing relentlessly on its weak seams. Then came the sound. It wasn't a roar or an explosion, but something far stranger, a deep, deafening, metallic shudder, like the sound of an entire railway car crumpling, followed by a series of sharp, whip-crack pops as the rivets holding the gargantuan structure together violently sheared off. The tank didn't merely burst, it disintegrated. The effect was instantaneous and cataclysmic. In a fraction of a second, the 2.3 million gallons of molasses, propelled by the internal pressure, were unleashed in a massive brown wave. It was a liquid battering ram, a non-Newtonian horror that defied expectation. The initial wave was estimated to be between 25 and 40 feet high and was moving at an astonishing speed, estimated by survivors and later analysis to be up to 35 miles per hour. The density and weight of the molasses made it unimaginably destructive. One survivor described the sound as a deafening rumble, like a machine gun. The first structures in its path were utterly annihilated. The fire station at 167 Commercial Street, a brick building, and simply swept it off its foundation, crushing it like an eggshell and entombing several city workers inside. The steel girders of the Boston Elevated Railway structure, massive supports weighing several tons, were bent and twisted by the force. A nearby shed and a stable were instantly pulverized, the horses inside either drowned or crushed. People had no time to react. They were caught in an instant where their world transformed from solid ground to a surging, dark brown hell. They were not merely swept along, they were impacted and then submerged. The stickiness of the molasses was its most terrifying weapon. Those who were hit by the initial wave were dashed against debris or against the few standing structures, suffering horrific blunt force trauma. But those who were merely knocked down and covered by the slower-moving tide faced a slower, more agonizing fate. The heavy, viscous syrup immediately began to cool in the mild January air, increasing its viscosity further, trapping people and animals as if they were caught in liquid cement. The list of the dead and wounded began to grow instantly. 21 people were killed, and over 150 were injured. The victims included dock workers, a teamster, a young girl named Maria D'Estasio, who was returning home with a basket of bread, and several municipal workers from the demolished fire station. The molasses acted as both a crushing weight and a suffocating trap. Victims struggled against the impossible stickiness, their clothes quickly becoming saturated, adding immense weight and making movement almost impossible. Horses, struggling to free themselves, thrashed violently, but the molasses gripped their legs, pulling them under. Their desperate cries added a horrific soundtrack to the disaster. The aftermath was chaos. Within minutes, the immediate area was flooded, a brown lake of molasses several feet deep. Emergency services struggled to reach the victims. Firefighters, police, and even Navy cadets from a nearby facility waded into the mess, but the nature of the medium made rescue attempts agonizingly slow. The molasses was so deep and dense that navigating it was like moving through wet concrete. Rescuers had to crawl, fight their way through, and often became so bogged down that they themselves needed rescuing. Every step was a Herculean effort. The entire waterfront was transformed into a grotesque scene. Victims were found in the most extraordinary and pitiable positions. A woman's body was recovered months later from a basement, trapped beneath a collapsed support beam. Others were frozen mid-stride, partially submerged, encased in the thickening ooze. The sheer volume of the molasses meant that it flowed off Commercial Street into adjacent alleyways and even seeped into the basements of nearby tenement buildings, creating subterranean tombs for those who happened to be below ground level. The cleanup was a nightmare that lasted for weeks, arguably months. For a time, the entire area reeked with the sickly, sweet, fermented smell of molasses, a potent, clawing odor that permeated the air, the buildings, and the very ground. Fire hoses pumping water barely made a dent. Firefighters resorted to pumping seawater and then sand onto the streets to absorb the stickiness.
Every item taken from the disaster zone, every rescue rope, every uniform, every tool had to be thoroughly scrubbed. For days, the harbor water itself ran brown with the dissolved molasses that finally made its way into the bay. The local legend is that even decades later, on hot summer days, the streets of the North End would still emit the faint, inescapable smell of sugar, a ghost of the disaster. The tragedy immediately became a legal battleground, an epic 6-year-long court case that in its own way was as monumental as the disaster. The victims and their families, mostly working-class immigrants, sued the U.S. Industrial Alcohol, USIA, the parent company of Purity Distilling, for negligence. USIA, armed with high-powered lawyers and corporate arrogance, first tried.
That was an excerpt of a massive historical work. Since you're asking for the next part of the story, I will continue the narrative of the day Molasses swallowed Boston, expanding on the immediate aftermath, the forensic investigation, and the cultural impact of this bizarre catastrophe, keeping the tone astonishing, factual, and continuous. The immediate aftermath of the Molasses wave was a grotesque tableau, a scene of impossible physics and heartbreaking human tragedy. The sheer, overwhelming viscosity of the molasses was the primary antagonist. It did not behave like water, which dissipates and flows. It behaved like a slow-setting resin. As the ambient temperature of the January afternoon, mild as it was, still dropped below the temperature of the fermentation-heated molasses, the syrup began to cool rapidly. This cooling caused its viscosity to exponentially increase, effectively turning the initial tidal wave into a massive, sticky sludge. The density of this sludge was so high that it trapped, held, and even buried victims with terrifying efficiency. Eyewitness accounts speak of rescuers needing to literally dig for bodies and survivors, not swim or wade. The North End, a densely packed labyrinth of narrow streets and old brick tenements, became a swamp of sugar. The molasses flow was so powerful, it pushed one of the Purity Distilling Company's massive delivery trucks off the street and into the second-story window of a nearby tenement building, a chilling testament to the force generated by 12,000 tons of propelled syrup. The very foundation of the elevated railway, the structure that carried the train tracks high above the disaster, was twisted and contorted. Engineers later discovered the immense pressure had literally shifted the track off its alignment, creating a risk that any train attempting to pass would have been derailed. This meant the wave's power was not just a momentary surge, it was a sustaining force capable of structural deformation on a major scale. The rescue effort was immediately complicated by the medium itself. Navy sailors from the USS Nantucket, docked nearby, were among the first to arrive. These men, trained for maritime emergencies, found themselves confronting an enemy unlike any they had prepared for. Their initial attempts to wade through the mess were often fruitless. They would sink past their knees, becoming quickly exhausted. The sticky substance clung to their boots, their trousers, their very skin, turning every step into a monumental exertion. The use of ropes was hampered because the molasses immediately coated them, making them slick yet sticky, impossible to grip firmly. Firefighters resorted to using their hoses not to wash the molasses away, an impossible task given the volume, but to create small channels of flowing water that could temporarily thin the syrup enough to allow slow movement toward a trapped victim. The official count of the dead, 21 people, was a grim roster of local life. Italian immigrant workers, Irish teamsters, the aforementioned firehouse crew. The injuries sustained by the over 150 survivors were equally horrific. Broken limbs, internal injuries from being slammed against debris, and severe, often debilitating respiratory issues from inhaling the suffocating fumes and thick syrup. But beyond the physical toll, there was the psychological trauma. The smell was perhaps the most enduring horror. fermenting molasses gives off a pungent, rum-like, yet sickly sweet aroma, heavy with the effluvium of decay and the iron scent of blood. The odor clung to everything, the rescuers' uniforms, the machinery, the houses, and the people for weeks. Locals complained that even their food tasted of molasses. The sheer difficulty of the cleanup led to one of the most absurd logistical problems in Boston history. Teams of men, augmented by military personnel and city workers, labored night and day. They didn't have modern chemical cleaners or high-powered steam jets. They used shovels, buckets, and massive amounts of seawater pumped from the harbor. This only partially worked, creating a less viscous, sugary slurry that still needed to be shoveled and hauled away in carts. The problem was so widespread that for days, every major street feeding into the North End was tracking brown goo. Carts, pedestrians, and streetcars inadvertently spread the sticky mess throughout the city. Legend has it that Boston Common and nearby subways were coated in molasses brought in on the shoes and coats of commuters. A silent, city-wide commemoration of the disaster. Even the beautiful brownstone steps of many Beacon Hill homes were said to have acquired a permanent, faint molasses hue from residents unwittingly trekking through the North End. The 6-year legal battle, proving corporate malice. The transition from emergency response to legal response began almost immediately, marking one of the most pivotal civil cases of the early 20th century. The victims and their families, many of whom had scant resources, banded together to sue the United States Alcoholic Company, USIA, the corporate behemoth responsible for the disaster. This was a battle between the powerful industrial elite and the marginalized working class, fought in an era when corporate responsibility for industrial accidents was often nebulous or simply dismissed. USIA's initial defense was outrageous and deeply cynical. Their legal team, trying desperately to deflect the blame from the known structural negligence of the tank, postulated the theory of anarchist sabotage. This was the height of America's post-war Red Scare, a time when fear of radical labor movements and foreign ideologies was rampant. USIA claimed the tank had been deliberately bombed by Italian anarchists, a calculated move to exploit xenophobia and paint the working-class victims, many of whom were Italian immigrants, as connected to the very terrorists who supposedly caused the explosion. This absurd claim required the court to believe that a powerful bomb could be smuggled onto the property and detonated precisely in a manner that replicated a structural failure from within, all while ignoring the obvious signs of a stressed tank. The court appointed Colonel Hugh W. Ogden as the master to hear the evidence. Ogden, a tough, meticulous lawyer and decorated veteran, spent 6 years on the case, presiding over more than 125 full days of testimony and hearing from nearly 3,000 witnesses, from engineers to dock workers, from survivors to corporate executives. His detailed, patient work turned the trial into a breakthrough exercise in forensic engineering. The crucial evidence presented by the plaintiff's attorney, George Alvin Sweetser, centered on a painstaking analysis of the tank's remains. Engineers demonstrated that the steel used in the construction of the tank was dangerously thin, only half the thickness required by the era's emerging safety standards for a vessel of that immense volume. More damningly, they showed the rivets, the hundreds of metal pins holding the steel plates together, were flawed. They were too few, too widely spaced, and made of substandard material. The construction crew, under the pressure of hurried executive Arthur Gell, skipped critical steps, including the simple yet essential practice of a hydrostatic test, which would have involved filling the tank with water to check for leaks and pressure tolerance before filling it with volatile, heavy molasses. Had this test been performed, the leak and subsequent disaster would have happened harmlessly with water, not fatally with 12,000 tons of syrup. The court rejected USIA's anarchist theory as baseless fear-mongering. Colonel Ogden's final, exhaustive report definitively concluded that the sole cause of the disaster was the structural failure of the tank due to gross negligence on the part of the Purity Distilling Company and its parent, USIA. This ruling was a massive victory for industrial accountability, establishing two key precedents for American law. First, that corporations could be held liable for the negligence of their construction and engineering oversight, and second, that detailed forensic evidence, rather than circumstantial or political fear, must form the basis of disaster claims. The ultimate settlement, a large sum for the time, provided a measure of justice for the victims and their families. The lingering stain and cultural memory. The Great Molasses Flood was a turning point. It forced the city of Boston to enact stringent new regulations for industrial construction, requiring greater municipal oversight, mandatory permits, and professional engineering sign-offs for large-scale storage vessels. The era of unchecked, self-regulated industrial building was over. The disaster literally changed the way American cities built and regulated their industrial infrastructure, making the lives of workers and neighboring residents demonstrably safer. Yet the absurdity of the disaster ensures its lasting place in local folklore. The event is a unique cultural touchstone for Boston, a bizarre intersection of history, physics, and human failure. The smell of molasses, as noted, became an indelible part of the area's identity. Decades later, residents of the North End, especially on warm and humid days,